supposed to be here, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure
It's around in the afternoon.
What's that?
I said, I'm not sure what's going on in the afternoon.
Okay, go.
How are you?
I didn't mess it up.
So, you want to go first, since you're saying?
Okay, so good morning. My name is Angel Hawk, and just to give you some brief background about who I am, I'm a master's level social worker. I also have my undergraduate degree in social work as well. Currently, I do group therapy as well as individual therapy in a psychiatric facility in South Atlanta. And so today we're going to talk about generational trauma, racialized violence in the Black community. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to go over the definition of mental health. We're also going to talk about the different types of trauma. And then we're going to move on to put in the application transgenerational trauma and look at a case study in regards to a lynching that occurred in Mississippi. And then we're also going to think about how all of this applies to you and skills to practice. Okay, so I want to start off with a quote that says that strong mother doesn't tell her cub, son, stay weak so the wolves can get you. She says, toughen up, this is the reality we live in. This is a quote from Lauren Hill that I used for the presentation that speaks more closely to the indoctrination of Black youth very early on. At some point or another in our development, we're told that our existence doesn't matter. And typically it can be regulated to whatever you're hearing in your household, however that message is conveyed. But what's interesting is how it gets echoed in social systems as well as public systems outside of our home. So when you think about mental health, you want to think about an individual's ability to be able to think, emote, and interact with one. So moving on to the balance of well-being, it's not simply just the absence of a clinical diagnosis. So you want to not think about it in a boxing way, in that form, but you do want to think about a person who's able to protect and advocate for the things that they believe in, whether it's cultural rights, whether it's civil liberties, but the ability to be able to understand what your personal limitations are and being able to understand your own capabilities as well. So mental health disparities in the Black community. One study has found that physicians were 23% more verbally dominant and engaged in 33% less patient-centered communication with African American patients. So what this slide is more or less saying is by the time you're in a interdisciplinary meeting with a client, so for example, as a social worker, we have to participate in interdisciplinary meetings with clients in terms of, it will be myself, the social worker, the client, some of their personal support. Sometimes you might see a primary care physician there, as well as a psychiatrist. So typically by the time you're the client sitting in that chair, the conversations are typically rushed, you're cut off, your suffering and your discomfort is not really listened to, so the care is not really customized to where the client is. Now, the difference is there's a lot of gray area because a part of that is just the way the treatment can be, but when you see a Black client in that chair, it's typically rushed through and is undermined by the time they're in that chair looking for treatment. It's not as customized as it could be. So we're going to move on to talk a little bit about complex trauma. So complex trauma includes some clinical diagnoses in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder. So some of the symptomology that you're going to see is emotional dysregulation. So you want to think about emotions that you're feeling that could be very overwhelming, but the inability to be able to have some level of self-control in that. It's also going to be triggered by multiple traumatic events as well as prolonged traumatic events. And it can be triggered by sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal, psychological abuse, as well as some neglect. So the epigenetics of trauma is the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression, transmitted through germ cells. Molecular mechanisms in trauma influences individuals and their offspring. So what this is saying is that organisms do have an influence in terms of change by the time you're looking at it under a microscope, in terms of organisms that might come from two parents. But what they are saying is that it raises the question to say, does this have an influence in trauma, but it doesn't definitively answer the question. Okay. So transgenerational trauma is defined as the transference of emotional and physical pain from one person to another or one generation to another. So some of the symptoms of that, where you will see it, is family, social, cultural, as well as neurobiological and genetic, which is what we touched on in the previous slide. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at transgenerational trauma as how it will be put into application in terms of the lynching, looking at that as a case study. So what you're going to use that is you're going to look at transgenerational trauma as a systematic outcome and how that can be viewed as a traumatic event, as well as the actual visual display of someone being lynched. Okay, so this is the case study of Seals and Boland. It was a lynching that occurred in Starksville, Mississippi in 1915. Okay, so the double hanging was of Deed Seals and Peter Boland. They were accused and confessed to the crime and they were condemned. And they were asked if this song could be played while they were being lynched. One of the things that I want to note is that typically when you're doing research about reading lynchings, what's left out or not is talked about as much as a lot of the physical intimidation that occurs. So what you see is that people are often forced into saying that they did something that they did not do because of the physical intimidation that happened prior to the lynching occurring. This picture is not a depiction of a lynching that occurred in Mississippi. This is actually a picture of a lynching in Indiana. I use this because I wanted to highlight the affect and the varying affect of people in this picture. But notice how you have people staring directly into the lens of the camera, almost to look into the future of the people looking on the other side of that picture. So the song that you just heard is titled "There is a Land of Pure Delight," which is a church hymn. And with that, we're going to talk a little bit more about indoctrination that occurs at a lynching site. So by the time you're at a lynching site, it's common to use church hymns as a way to indoctrinate you in terms of the spiritual placement of what you're seeing. To say, well, if I'm hearing this hymn being played, there's a larger place for this lynching to occur in order for it to make some level of sense if you're participating in the lynching, as well as language that's being performed at that time. So look but don't see is a combined word that some people typically use today, like look-see, or even peekaroo, and things like that. Language like that is combined to make almost like a slang in regards to create some level of emotional disconnect. Because by the time you see someone lynched, you're supposed to look at the violence, but not see the man, not see the person, not see humanity. All of these things were working together in order for people to be able to actively participate in the lynching, whether you're 5 years old, whether you're 50 years old, and still be able to turn around and live in that same community. So is this my problem? Yes, it's everyone's problem. So a lot of the things that we have a relationship with, like fear, are still current today. We all have a unique relationship to that. But the context of fear and the way it existed in 1915 when lynchings were more commonplace, whether it was a systematic outcome or whether it was just someone felt like killing that day, fear in the context of how it existed then is a different sphere. So the only way we can understand and know that world is through research. But the ripple effect of what fear is in relationship to how African Americans understand it is a little bit different. But that's something that pulls us together because we all have that unique relationship with that. But the scope of our story as human beings are definitely changing, because ultimately forgiveness is what we all want for ourselves and what we want for other people. But how do you accomplish that as you understand history, we understand the expansion of our families, and we understand how uncomfortable the relationship to change can be. But the indicator is the more uncomfortable change is, that's probably the place where you need to lean into a little bit more. So what are some skills of practice? First, you need to determine where your environment is and making sure that's a safe environment if you're talking about things that are more intense, like lynchings. So provided that the space that you're in is safe, you want to lean towards, instead of suppressing uncomfortable conversations, you want to express more of your thoughts and feelings associated with what you're understanding as historical evidence. And then being able to take a step further to discover what that new story is. Do you have a connection with it now? Do you not? What are some feelings that might be associated with that? And also, acceptance is not permission. So with understanding historical evidence of how people were lynched and how some of that was a systematic outcome, some of it wasn't, understanding the story for what it is and allowing it to be as it is, without influence of what we want it to be, and making that a separate component, but then moving on to say, now what are my thoughts in reference to what it is I'm reading, what it is I'm researching, and then being able to separate that component to say, now what emotions come up as I look at this picture? What emotions come up as I read information about the community distance that they were able to create and still go back to their community after the physical violence? So the acceptance of history as it is, and also examining your emotions and feelings associated with those things, leaves it open for investigation for yourself. So in conclusion, there's a voice that doesn't use words. Listen. Thank you.
All right, why don't you join us here at the table, and we'll have our second presenter. Do you want to present from here or go up there?
I'll go up there.
PowerPoint. We have a third presenter who may join us, but if not, then we have a little more time for discussion. I have a lot of thoughts, so we'll hold those. Thank you for your presentation.
Okay.
Did you say Jasmine or Jasmine?
Jasmine.
Jasmine. All right. Jasmine, help. Thank you. Trying to make it big.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I. Okay, here we go. All right, I guess that's as good as it's gonna get.
It looks good.
Okay. My name is Jasmine Chavez Helm, and I am from New York. I graduated from FIT with a master's in fashion history. And this presentation is entitled Recuerdos de Nicaragua, Remembering the Dress of the Indigenous and Afro-Descendants of Nicaragua in German Moravian Photography. So what can dress reveal about people, communities, and their history in a specific place? Well, let me begin with place. My research focuses on the indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua. The region extends from southeast Honduras along the eastern coastline of Nicaragua. This area was not colonized by the Spanish like the rest of Nicaragua. Rather, it was established as a British protectorate in 1740 and then functioned as an autonomous region, and still does very much so to this day. The area is home to several indigenous groups, including the Mosquito, the Mayangna, Rama, and Afro-descendant groups, the Garifuna, Creole, and Caribbean communities. In this presentation, I analyze the German Moravian-produced ethnographic photographs of the Mosquito, Mayangna, and Creole communities to understand their dress practices. In 1849, the German Moravian Church began a Protestant Christian mission in Nicaragua and built churches along the Mosquito Coast. Quote, unlike other Europeans of that era, they, Moravians, did not come to the Caribbean coast of Central America in search of riches, notes scholar Benjamin Tillman. Rather, the missionaries' goal was to convert the native populations to Protestant Christianity. The Moravian missionaries established infrastructure and civic support that significantly affected the ethnic groups of the coast and altered their material culture, including dress. The missionaries used European-style dress as a conversion tool and spread news of their work through photography. Many of the photographs published were circulated as postcards for tourists entitled Recuerdos de Nicaragua. The images were also used internally to document Moravian conversion and were reproduced for numerous publications and presentations as a form of propaganda. And Moravians did this all over the world during this early 20th century time period. In these images, indigenous people are depicted as quote-unquote heathens in traditional indigenous dress or as good Christians in European-style garments. In contrast, Afro-descendant Creoles were photographed solely wearing European-style ensembles. I studied the photographs to understand how the dress and visual of the Mosquito and Mayangna changed, and how the dress of the Creole functioned due to the presence of the Moravian. The mosquito are native to Nicaragua and have been in contact with Europeans since their arrival in the 1400s. Around 1641, a maroon slave ship of Africans landed on the shore and integrated with the mosquito tribe. Afterward, the tribe divided into two groups, the pure Tawida, which means straight hair, and the mixed African native Sambo mosquito, the larger and more politically dominant group. The Mayangna or the Sumo are a smaller tribe located in the interior region of the coast. In the 1600s, they were pushed inland as the Sambo mosquito were subsequently capturing and selling them as slaves. The tribe's remoteness aided their ability to remain independent and arguably resist most European contact until the Moravian mission presence. Many Africans and Black Caribbeans were enslaved by the British to work in timber yards and fruit plantations on the Mosquito Coast. During this period, the African and Black Caribbeans frequently worked alongside free and enslaved indigenous people. As a result, intermarriage and interpersonal relationships between Africans, natives, and Europeans were commonplace and formed the Creole community. When slavery was abolished in Latin America around 1824, in Central America, I should say, free Black Caribbeans migrated to the coast and contributed to the growing Creole community. Dress functions as a medium of communication that can be used to recognize and identify an individual or cultural group. The mosquito and Mayangna have overlapping traditional dress elements, including the production of their main textile, tuno cloth, which is made from the bark cloth of the tuno tree. Men in both tribes traditionally wore tuno loincloths, while Mayangna and mosquito women went topless and wore wrapped tuno skirts paired with beads and body paint. The clothing of enslaved Africans and Black Caribbeans in the Americas is modeled after the dress of their white masters and regulated by them as well. Captain George Henderson reported in 1809 that quote-unquote Negro clothing was imported for the enslaved population, and that each slave in the Mosquito Coast of Honduras was given 2 suits of Osenberg muslin and a pair of horseshoe. Once dress exists, it can be restricted by the moral and aesthetic beliefs of a society, and the Moravians exercise this notion. They utilize European-style garments like long-sleeve dresses for women and shirts and trousers for men to impose their own social mores of modesty and civility to the Mosquito, Mayangna, and Creole people. So this is a screenshot that I took of a photograph by Carl Anton Mueller, and it shows the old heathen and the new Christian, and that's typical language that was used to describe the indigenous people of this area. The transition from traditional clothing to Western European style dress is best documented in Moravian and German produced photography. Together, clothing and photography became key conversion tools for the Moravian missionaries because they considered European clothing to be civilized and encouraged indigenous and Creole people to wear it, which ultimately resulted in acculturation and ethnocide. European dress and a clean appearance were examples of successful acculturation and conversion of the Mayangna and the Mosquito. This concept is reinforced by Carl Anton Mueller. He explained that, quote, as a Christian community life develops, it becomes evident that the very primitive clothing of heathen times must be replaced by neat and becoming garments. He believed that this dress transition was a part of good Christian training. The Creole and Black Caribbean communities were already acculturated to European-style clothing as a result of enslavement by the time the Moravians began photographing their missionary work in the Mosquito Coast, and few descriptions of Creole dress pre-Moravian contact exist. Captain Henderson provided one of the earliest descriptions and observed that wealthy property-owning free Black Creoles had, quote-unquote, an extravagant passion for dress. Creoles and Black Caribbeans became important allies to the Moravian missionaries when they arrived because they spoke English, were anglicized, and receptive to the Christian gospel. Several Black, Jamaican, and Creole men became some of the most successful missionaries and wore European-style suits that met the dress standards of their Moravian colleagues. The Creole elite participated in fashion and luxury and purchased European textiles, clothing, and materials imported into the coast, and used clothing to communicate and maintain their elevated social status within the eyes of the Moravians. Moravian missionaries became a central part of society and culture in the Mosquito Coast, and they implemented systems that significantly altered the dress, appearance, and material cultures of the coastal communities. Despite the Moravian presence, in recent years, the Mosquito, Mayangna, and Creole have worked to reclaim their cultural dress practices. The Center for Autonomy and Development of Indigenous Peoples developed initiatives to replant tuna trees and reinvigorate tuna cloth production among the Mayangna and the Mosquito. The Creole communities have annual festivals and carnivals and pageants to honor their complex history in the coast. These types of dress reclamation practices enable the Mosquito, Mayangna, and the Creole to celebrate their past and preserve it for their future. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge those in the Americas that continue to risk their lives in defending their land and civil rights against settler colonialism. And on January 30th, a couple of weeks ago, the BBC reported that armed men attacked a Mayangna group in the protected Wasawas Biosphere Reserve, killing 6 people and kidnapping 10. The Mayangna community have continually fought against settlers from Western Nicaragua interested in illegally exploiting their land and reserves for timber and cattle industries. And this is an epidemic throughout the Americas. Black and Indigenous land defenders and civil rights protectors are being massacred. Gustavo Lino, the Mayangna leader, explained, "They're exterminating us little by little, and the state is doing nothing." Thank you.
While you rejoin us, I want to make a couple comments, but maybe have some space to really have a discussion, because you both presented really interesting, really different things, and there are definitely some points of connection as well. Certainly what you ended with circles back to the question of trauma. And unfortunately, trauma is a consistent theme through all of white settler colonial history. And so I think that's a linking theme that we have here we need to contend with. Some of my thoughts going to the first presentation. I love watching the development of your work. I saw it last year as well, and it's a really important theme. There's just so much importance to the work you're doing, and one thought, a bunch of thoughts for me to throw these out. So the relationship of the medical community as a whole to the Black population in the United States is fraught. And one of the books I use in one of my classes is Medical Apartheid. I don't know if you've come across it. It's a devastating 400-page indictment of all of the racism that's come through the medical system. And so one of the conclusions of that book is that the so-called irrational fear of the Black community's in relation to the medical establishment is not irrational at all. Dr. Washington basically points out in the book that it's a highly rational fear, and for people to call it irrational means they don't really understand. So there's like the trauma of the medical community, the fear of it, and the protection, and then that itself is stigmatized as yet another problem. So just in terms of framing, broadly, there's this huge history that's only being looked at a little bit right now. And then within that, all these medical things, there's a lot of stigma, not just in Black communities, but in many oppressed communities, about getting therapy in general and dealing with mental health. And a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that you have a history of mental health therapeutic activity really coming from a bourgeois elite space, a white space. And so it's seen as sort of a bougie or privileged thing. And what ends up happening then is that folks who really need the mental health support get less of it as a result of that. So there's so many broad themes. And then another theme is this question about whether so let me ask a really broad question. This may be too broad for you to address, but also Western Enlightenment thought says that we are all individuals, but most traditional cultures from Africa and the Americas don't really have concepts of individuality. We're parts of communities. And so one of the things I've always wondered about with therapy is that the individual is always getting treated, but there's not really a treatment of, say, the family history, the multi-generational things. And you touched on that with the question of epigenetic transference. We're just discovering that historical trauma can actually be passed on at a biological level, which is pretty alarming. I generally tend to be more concerned about the psychological side because we do receive things, but the individual has their own, trajectory. I also just think it's so cool to see you doing this work because, as far as I know, complex trauma as a more nuanced diagnosis than PTSD is only maybe 10 years old or something like that. So, it's not very old. PTSD has only gotten taken seriously quite a bit after, Vietnam. And so this is new terrain. So I'm just really glad to see you doing that work, and I think more of it needs to be done. So those are like some passing thoughts. And then some passing thoughts on your paper as well. It's really exciting to see the work. I should disclose that I'm editing with Stephen a collection of writings, and your pieces are both going to be in those collections. So this is an ongoing process of refining and getting this work out there, which I'm really excited about. So I think it's so cool that your work uses fashion, which is unusual, as a lens to culture. And then also the photographic evidence just jumps us back in time and shows us things. There's so much there to look at. Couple suggestions in terms of framing. I thought about the concept of marronage, of the way in which people create maroon communities, essentially by escaping from white settler colonialism and all its violence. And I think at the coast of Nicaragua, there's elements of that. You talk about how is it Mayagna, Native community literally left the coastal strip and moved into the interior because they were threatening people there. So one of the main responses of indigenous communities was just to relocate and say, we just want to be left alone. There's a book, which I'll have to remember the title of, going way back to my undergrad days. There's a book that made a huge impact on me, and it covers this from an anthropology perspective, so you can cite it. It's by a guy named Bodley, B-O-D-L-E-Y. And he talks about people essentially removing themselves from colonialism, fleeing and relocating to other spaces. And then within the Black tradition, you have this concept of marronage, and throughout the Americas, basically liberated spaces that people create, and where they're able to continue to have their own culture. So then, I also have questions about, were there other missionaries besides these Moravians? Were there contending missionaries who showed up at that point and said, here's the way to be Christian, no, do it our way? Were there other denominations, or were they the only folks in town, so they were the one main way to do that? And even just connecting to some of those histories, there's such a long history. Theoretically, the big link to me would be Las Casas, who, is all the way back to the 1530s, but is essentially saying, let's not exterminate natives, let's convert them. It's the conversion concept. So by the time you get to these folks, that's like trying to do the math here, 300 and some years old at that point, this tradition of forced conversion and so on. But anyway, I just think it's so evocative, the photography and what you see in that, and to think about dress as a space of colonization and decolonization, and reclaiming of identity. So with those broad themes that this is what I was struck by. I don't know if y'all want to respond to any of that, but mainly I just want to open it up and have a little discussion. Anything that was helpful or interesting?
In terms of other missionary groups, the Moravians definitely seem to be the most dominant, because prior to them, a lot of the colonialism that was occurring was mainly economic, in terms of the British, and it was mainly the British that were in that area, really wanting to take advantage of the natural resources there, and the United States in terms of like banana plantations and fruit plantations and sugarcane and stuff like that. So it didn't seem like the Spanish they weren't interested in that region. And so there wasn't really a Catholic presence. And however, I did talk to someone on Instagram whose father, she's Creole, and her grandfather was Moravian, and then he started his own Protestant church, I believe. So I'm trying, and then he was the first one to kind of branch off, apparently. So I'm trying to get in touch with her without being like, you know, a fangirl or harassing or something like that. I'm like, tell me everything. But I'm hoping maybe I could find more evidence of it, even just that little fact is kind of helpful.
It's so interesting that the rest of the country would be largely under Catholic colonial auspices, and here you have a Protestant situation, which is very different. Another thing is when the colonizers decide, hey, we're not interested in this place, they tend not to build roads and railways, and so there's no infrastructure, and those places tend to get what we call underdeveloped. But then actually, from the point of view of maintaining culture, that's always a positive, because there's less people who can come there through tourism and other things. And so in my own work in Kenya, the community I researched at the coast defeated the British militarily in 1917, and then were abandoned by all their plans. And so it means they have less folks who made it to university, less involvement in the economy, but then also maybe the ability to maintain some indigenous traditions a little bit more as well. So it's an interesting two-sided coin, what that means being left out of quote-unquote development in the nation, which I think is interesting. Let's open it up to our guests. Any thoughts from our audience, questions?
I actually have a question. I thought, like we talked about it earlier, but the theme between your presentations is kind of dealing with imagery and how imagery can impact people's cultures and how that can have an impact on individuals. And so, for Jasmine, would you think that seeing images of someone actively being colonized and that being archived has an impact on the way that you're always discussing?
Yeah, I definitely think so. For me, I started this project as a way to kind of heal familial trauma. I'm estranged from my dad, who is of Afro-Amerindian descent. We haven't spoken in since I was 18. I'm 32 now. That's math. So I was trying to unpack some of that, and I really came to this research just out of curiosity of like what my heritage is, and because I didn't grow up with him, so I wasn't familiar with the culture. So it was like, since I study fashion and dress, and like I figured that would be like a good way for me to deal with that, using something that I like to understand why he was dealing with his life decisions. And also he had a lot of internalized racism as well, which is not uncommon for a lot of Black Latinos within like the society. So I was just trying to unpack that, and then like found this research as well, and then reading and seeing the images. It was the first image I ever saw was a Moravian postcard, which led me down this road, and it labeled Mayagna people as sumo heathen Indians. And so that label of being a heathen and depicted in a very particular way, and then there are just quotes throughout that talk about, Creoles are very nice and polite, but the Negro from the West Indies is like noisy and boisterous, and you're drunk, and like all these, primary resources that I was using were, early, or either coming from Moravians or like early 20th century anthropologists, and it was just racist and painful to read and kind of like grapple with.
So one of the things that's also interesting with your presentation in mind is the function of the way media is used in terms of pictures. And it's interesting because by the time they're showing people of a certain group in terms of a certain class, there's no variation in that. It's almost like they fit a certain profile.
Yeah.
And to me, that's one of the striking connections with that. So for example, when you see someone lynched, we know as African Americans, we have all types of different looks and variations, but by the time we see a lynching photo, it's always of some African American male, not too tall, not too short, very dark skin and complexion, and even the clothes. Typically, you're not seeing people that are in different types of clothes. It's usually clothes of someone who is a working class person, someone who's more industrial. And so to me, it's like asking the questions of, well, what type of messaging was this supposed to be sent to us that we bought into, and even globally, and even within the white community as they're looking at these photos in terms of what type of socialization is okay. It's okay because the bedrock of our community looks like this person that's also being lynched right here. And then you turn around and you see photos of people that were classified as heathens, as well as people who converted to whatever the spiritual circumstances were of that time. But again, even looking at those photos, they all fell into a certain visual archetype of what that person looks like. And so I find that to be interesting, and how the colorism aspect plays into it, and then all these other moving pieces that add context to that as well.
It's really deep. I mean, both your presentations show us how violent the whole colonial process was, but beyond just the military violence, you have this cultural violence, this naming violence, this dehumanization that takes place, and the struggle to reclaim and reassert one's humanity in those conditions is really intense. I'm really struck by both the presentations because that piece is really deep, and I happen to be at a lecture on Thursday night in the city that I organized. We had a guest speaker, and we were talking. I just want to share with you Sylvia Winter's theories, and she's not very well known, and she's becoming much better known. And she's going from obscurity to people are recognizing she's one of the maybe most brilliant intellectuals of the 20th century. She's still alive and quite old now. So it's Winter, W-Y-N-T-E-R, and she talks about the way in which the colonial process and the Western colonization, really, of the rest of the world, starting in the 1490s, really, creates this two categories of humans, the human and the non-human, essentially. And by being called the non-human or the non-norm, the norm and the non-norm, this is the category by which you're stripped of your humanity and seen as less human. And it's at a very deep intellectual level. And there's all these manifestations of that. The most violent manifestations are things like these horrific lynchings, which prove it literally manifests the dehumanization of the body and the attack of the violence towards the body. There's this flip side, though. In her thing, it's always relational. So there's a norm and a non-norm. The non-norm is non-white folks, people who are being colonized, people of African descent, people of indigenous descent. The norm is the white folks, and so your photo, and these photos are always haunting of the white people attending a lynching, and smiling and feeling casual and looking into the camera and being proud to record, hey, I'm here. They're not hiding their faces, and the fact that that's publicly celebrated is part of how whiteness and the norm, the dominant identity, is constructed as well. And there's a side question which you and others don't have any obligation to address, but comes up as a result of this work, which is, as this dehumanization of oppressed people happens, are the oppressors also dehumanized in a different way that we wouldn't equate? But what does it mean to feel entitled to lynch people, or to attend a lynching, or to show up in Nicaragua and say, these people are heathens, these people need to dress differently? I have a superior idea and a superior culture. What does that do to create arrogance, entitlement, centeredness, dominant identities, all those kinds of things? And is that colonizing people in a very different way? So that relationality, we call it relationality, the self-other relationship. And Winter's theories are really deep on all of that. She's the one who really talks about, in the most profound way, what does this dehumanization process mean? And how do we create a humanizing process again? And it's clear that the answer is going to have to be something beyond Western culture. And this is where reconnecting with and re-immersing in non-Western cultures, African and Indigenous cultures in particular, is probably our greatest path forward to get out of these dynamics, because traditional cultures never really had those violent self-other dichotomies. So I did want to share that with you all. Are there other comments, questions, things you saw in the presentation you wanted to pull out and look at more closely? Things you were struck by? If you don't want to share.
I've actually never really thought about the actual physical, the depictions of people in lynchings. So I thought that was really interesting, because as much as you studied it and talked about it, people have never really talked about the specifics of, like, they're not too tall, they're not too short, they have on this kind of dress, they have that kind of thing. So I thought that was really interesting.
Because it's a profile of the
Yeah, and
type
I've
of
never
person
seen
they're
that
getting.
before.
And it's a method to all that, but it's not enough language to really couple with that.
Right.
But as you're seeing the common threads of all that, is a type of profile of man that they're always gearing towards.
Right.
But then how does that play out today in terms of profiling Black people, profiling Black women and Black men? I think there's one lynching photo of a Black woman, but the rest are, right. And so that leads to another question, because if they were inflicting that kind of violence on Black men, they were doing that to Black women, but where's the documentation that's equivalent to that? And then there are companies associated with these pictures that are being taken. And it's just like these companies get bought out and transition, into other things. So it's like these people behind the cameras, they don't necessarily go anywhere, but they change into other things. And so being able to, talk about that in reference to there's a definite connection to it. And I believe the World Health Organization, they also say when they talk about statistically, they view it as white and non-white in those realms too.
What's the white and non-white? What do you mean?
In terms of how they evaluate people in reference to this people group, of how they measure it against everybody else in terms of what they're looking at statistically. And I say that to say, when you're looking at all this information in terms of how African Americans are marginalized, you're noticing that it doesn't necessarily apply overarchingly, but the way we go into treatment and some of the stories vary. So there are people that are able to afford outpatient services, but by the time you're looking for therapy in the community, if it costs $100, you're less likely to be consistent with it because that's compromising another bill that you're paying. So by the time that we need help, we're in more of a crisis situation to where we need all things in place to where not only do we need the treatment, but we're needing housing, we're needing some type of medical intervention, all of those things. So we're hospitalized. So it's either one of the other in that regard. So I just wanted to touch on that as well.
Absolutely.
That's a really good point.
Can I ask about, in the Nicaraguan context, there were things you touched on that I wanted to go deeper in, but so one of the distinguishing, the Moravian categories was based on hair, good hair and bad hair.
That was actually, so the mosquito group themselves, when there was like the division between the Sambo, which Sambo is the English term that comes from the Spanish caste system, Zambo, which is an admixture between Black and Indigenous person. And then, so they kind of divided into two groups. So the Tawida is a described term the mosquito group gave themselves for being like pure, because they recognize the difference, I guess. And, but it's interesting in the dynamics because the Sambo mosquito were the larger group and became the more like politically engaged with the British and sort of exercised their power and created like a hierarchical like structure within their tribal group that kind of mirrored British royal politics. Like there was a mosquito king, and the British at that time were like, okay, we'll give you that title, whatever, if that means we can continue to trade. So there are a lot of, just because of all of the closeness of the communities, there's a lot of like, I guess like micro categories in terms of discussing race and how it functions there that I don't totally understand. I've never been there. I started this project like from, my bed, looking at pictures on the internet, and it was, thank God for Google Books and eBay and all of that, because I don't know how I would have done this without it. So there's a lot more that I need to understand, but I think Edmund Gordon he's at UAT, or University of Texas in Austin. He wrote about the Creole community in the Mosquito Coast, and he has a pretty interesting, he wrote an interesting text about how it functions there.
Yeah.
And
One of the things that happens is when white settler colonialism happens, when colonization happens, there's an acceptance of the conceptual categories of the dominant group. So there was no, before the British and the Spanish or in Nicaragua, nobody's thinking about dividing society based on good hair and bad hair, as though there is such a thing as good hair and bad hair. Which in Spanish is actually the right term. People use pelo malo and pelo bueno, which is really, overtly racialized and sort of there, but everybody's sort of like, oh, we just don't really think about that. This is built into our culture. So there's these ways that racism gets embedded and it's sort of normalized and things like that.
And that's one of the things that I also thought was interesting that you brought up earlier in reference to the other side of how white people can also be traumatized as well as African Americans, because it's somewhat socialized and acceptable to talk about how African Americans are suffering openly, which I think is a good space for that. But when you look at a lynching photo, you're looking at the African Americans, but the larger concept is the European communities that are participating. So the same way we absorb that transference of traumatic events, so are the European people there as well. But it's normalized. So when we fast forward to today, and you're seeing people that are profiled and killed, unjustified, and by the time someone's on the other side of that, that might not look like us as African Americans, it's a distance there. They might not have that same disconnect. But if it's another type of life to where it's an animal, it might be more of a closeness to that. So all of that is a socialization that's connected to something, but where does it come from?
Right. And grounding, as you do, both of you do, grounding our present in these colonial pasts and the terminologies and the violence that comes from helps us understand how this could even be happening in the present, how Black lives could be not considered to matter as much as the lives of dogs and pets is a contradiction that some of us are seeing and calling out, and other folks are just not even noticing that's happening around us. So these are important paths that you both are charting to help us understand our present through these lenses. I think the past can really illuminate those things. So I think you both do a really good job in that. I'm getting the indication that we are out of time, which is good. It's a nice way to start our morning with this discussion, and I think there's a lot of unfinished threads that we continue to discuss throughout the day. So thank you to our guests. Any announcements of what's next? Is there something here? Should we all?
So we have Aaron from our archives. She'll be coming in to show some things in the case of archives.
Let me move this over a little bit.
Does it sound good?
Yep, that works.
Cool.
Great, okay. I am ready.
I love this. I love this.
Okay, just let me know when I should get started, Jamie.
You are good.
Great. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Joellen Williams and I'm the Special Collections Curator in the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books here at KSU. So my office is right upstairs. So I work directly with the Kennesaw State University Archives and Special Collections, and I'm also the lead curator for the Bentley Rare Book Museum. So today we are going to be looking at a collection of materials from our, it's really from our archival collection related to Cherokee history. But we're going to talk about it in a very specific way because there are some issues that come up when it comes to collecting the materials of Indigenous people, when it comes to understanding this group of people that has been a huge part of Georgia history. So it's called Whose Story Is It Anyway? So we're going to be looking at how primary sources can sometimes give us conflicting, challenging views of things. It's not always just because it's old, it's true. As I try to tell the students that I work with. All right. So can someone tell me what happened on this day in history?
Symposium started.
Okay, the symposium started. Did you attend?
Yes.
So you attended the first day of symposium.
Yes.
Okay.
I almost gave birth.
You did.
Oh, this day, February 7th, you mean? Any February 7th?
2020.
We're here.
You were here at work? Okay. Anybody else? So
Two people who testified against Donald Trump at the House impeachment
Were-
hearings were fired, Vindman and someone.
there we go. Okay, very good. Anybody else? I went to Whole Foods with my sister in the evening. My sister, my baby. It was fun. Went to work.
I drove here yesterday.
You drove here yesterday? Whenever I ask this question, people are like, "Oh my gosh, there's something in history that
Yeah, I'm
I'm
trying to
missing."
figure out what did I miss?
What happened?
It's a trick question.
But what I'm trying to get you to see is it depends on who you ask. What happened yesterday? Same thing about what happened in any day in history. It depends on who you ask. Some of us were here at KSU. Some of us were driving. Some of us went to work. Some of us went out to eat. Some did all those things. It just depends on who you're asking. So I wanted you to kind of understand that's exactly how we're going to be viewing everything that we're looking at today. It depends on who you're asking. And we have to think about who are we asking? What is their point of view? Why might they say that in the historic records that tell us about our past? And so some of this, again, you may already know, especially if you're a scholar, already kind of know these things, but I wanted to go over primary sources and archives. Primary sources are materials that contain firsthand events that contain records of firsthand events or that were created contemporaneous to those events. So that means that things like newspapers, diaries, photographs, oral histories, those things count as primary sources. Now, sometimes, in the case of often an oral history, it was not created maybe during the time of the events that it's talking about, but it was recalled by an eyewitness. That also counts. And then I think it's interesting, sometimes we don't often talk about the difference between primary sources and archives. Even me, an archivist, we use them interchangeably, but they are slightly different. Archives are materials that are created by a person, family, or organization in the conduct of their affairs, and they are preserved because of their enduring value. That's really the main part. One of the ways I try to illustrate the difference between primary sources and archives, I hate to throw the Library of Congress under the bus, but they tried. When y'all may remember when Twitter first became popular in 2006. The Library of Congress shortly decided we are going to archive every tweet. That was their goal. And so the big Twitter archive, which seemed to be a great idea, but then years kind of went by and archivists were like, so what's going on with the Twitter archive? We haven't heard a lot of updates. And then in, I believe, late 2017, the Library of Congress announced they're actually not going to be archiving every tweet. They were going to be doing what they do with all their other collections. They're going to be appraising them, deciding which ones to keep and which ones to discard. And because there was just way too many, as you can imagine, way too many. So what I wanted to kind of use that to show, when you try to keep everything, you're not able to find anything, and it's just impossible. So archives are those materials that we preserve because they mean something to us. Primary sources we create every day, sticky notes, receipts, those are all primary sources, but we don't always need them. We don't, most primary sources we throw away. Text messages, we delete, our phones will not work if we keep every picture, every text, every record that we create. So all archives are primary sources, but not all primary sources are considered archives. And we went over some examples. And again, it depends on who you ask, because I said enduring value, but according to who, which is a big conversation in the archival community. According to who? What makes something important? Who decides that it's important? And when we're, especially in this case, when we are deciding what's important on behalf of a group of people or another community, who are we to do that? These questions are very important when you're doing archival work. Archives and primary sources are history in its rawest form that help us create a complex, multifaceted, and oftentimes contradictory record of history, because that's what it is. History is messy. It is not one story, it's many stories, many perspectives. And so here at KSU, we seek to preserve an inclusive record. That's what we strive to do. We strive to make sure that we are documenting all aspects of our communities so that we can fulfill our mission statement. And that is one of the reasons why we collect Cherokee materials. Our goal in the Kennesaw State University Archives is to not only collect university records, but also records of the North and Northwest Georgia community that make us who we are. So again, Cherokee history definitely falls within that. And so we're going to see the way that we understand primary sources is very different than we understand maybe regular pieces of information. So when we look at a document, let's say this one here, which is kind of a land deed here, we see, and we'll get a chance to see everything up close, but we see handwritten, we see some, we're like, okay, so we have to understand, okay, this was what time period this is, I wonder what geographic area it's talking about, we have to see, okay, let's look at even the preservation here, kind of how, okay, it looks like this was folded at one point. Does this mean it was sent to someone? Let's take a look at the paper quality. Why are there holes in it? Was it used? Where would this have been kept? All those kinds of things. So that includes, so not only what does it say, but also how is it structured? When was it written? Who might have been the creator and why would they have created this? Who was this for? Are we the intended audience? Probably not. who would have been the attended audience, different things like that. Which voices do we hear? So even in a simple document, when you look at it in a way that an archivist would look at it, or a historian, it's different than sometimes, and then you would think it takes longer. That's why I always tell students when they come and do research, I'm like, let's make our appointment prior to just like the day before. So let's make sure that we give ourselves time to explore and understand all these things. So we're going to do that specifically with our Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. We only have one issue of the Cherokee Phoenix here in the KSU archives. It is in plastic right now, so there's a bit of a glare. So we kind of you'll have to come up and see it later. But it is in this plastic because it really can't be outside of it for very long. It's preservation issues there's various preservation issues. But what I want to tell you about the Cherokee Phoenix, this particular issue, it is from December 25th, 1830. So it is really a nice piece. And again, everyone will be able to see it soon. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about why this piece is important and why it's going to frame our discussion for today. So the Cherokee language, the Cherokee written language, is actually a syllabary instead of an alphabet, and it was developed in 1821 by Sequoyah. It took them a while to make it. So a syllabary, again, this is hard for us who are very alphabet-based, but a syllabary is different in that I believe I think instead of having every symbol means just one sound, or it's going to be a consonant and vowel combination. That's kind of how it's put together. And the Cherokee Phoenix, which is the first newspaper published by Native Americans in the U.S., and it is a bilingual newspaper. So if you look at it up close, you'll see English and you'll see the Cherokee language. It was published at New Echota, which is near Calhoun, Georgia. So you just go up 75, keep going and keep going. You'll get there. You can see the Chief Band House. You can see all the wonderful sites up there. The Cherokee government did run out of funds for printing in 1834, but it's been kind of revived, and I think it technically now is still in print, but it kind of had to be renamed and revived over a couple times. And the publisher was Elias Goodnow, and he also influenced the paper a lot. So, interesting thing I think about the Cherokee Phoenix is that yes, it was a bilingual newspaper, but only about, I think, 1/5 of the newspaper was actually in Cherokee because a lot of the publishers and printers didn't actually know Cherokee very well. And then also sometimes its messages seemed like they might have been influenced a little bit by specific viewpoints. So sometimes you have to almost take it with a grain of salt. But the point of the Cherokee Phoenix was to provide information to the Cherokee Nation about issues that pertain to them. So a lot of times they often reprinted articles from different newspapers that had to do with the Cherokee Nation. And as you can imagine, during this time, there was a lot of discussion surrounding, excuse this phrase, but the Indian question is what they used to call it. So there was a lot that Cherokees would have wanted to know about what the government was deciding and worrying about kind of what they were going to do with these lands, because we're approaching the Trail of Tears time period right now. So everyone should have some excerpts. I think 3 excerpts. We're not going to have a chance to look at, I think, every excerpt, but I wanted you to kind of have a written copy so that you can see it. Now, the discussion questions at the bottom, I wanted to show those. I use these for classes that I teach. So I wanted to kind of show you some of the questions that I ask students. Usually they're doing this in group work. Each group will have a different excerpt that they're looking at. So I transcribed it for them since we only have one of these issues. And then we get a chance to really take a look at what is it saying and who is saying this. And let's get into it. So I'm going to, let's take a look at the first excerpt here. Let's see. Okay. So this first excerpt From the National Intelligence extract from the president's message. So this is one of the examples of when the Cherokee Phoenix would reprint a section of a paper from a different newspaper because it pertained to the Cherokee Nation. So I put this here, written by President Andrew Jackson, reprinted the Cherokee Phoenix. Okay, so this is President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, if we know anything about Andrew Jackson, responsible for the treaties, quote unquote, with Native Americans and for really implementing the Trail of Tears. So right here, he's kind of summarizing the progress they've made on, again, quote unquote, the Indian question. So President Jackson says, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. Two important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages." Now, the two tribes that he's talking about are the Choctaw and the Chickasaw tribes. And then he goes to explain why a speedy removal is important. The consequences of a speedy removal will be important to the United States, to individual states, and to the Indians themselves. The pecuniary advantages which it promises to the government are the least of its recommendations. It puts an end to all possible danger of collision between the authorities of the general and state governments on account of the Indians. It will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. By opening the whole territory between Tennessee on the north and Louisiana on the south to the settlements of the whites, it will incalculably strengthen the southwestern frontier and render the adjacent states strong enough to repel future invasion without remote aid. It will relieve the whole state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy, and enable those states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way, and under their own rude institutions, will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. So that is President Andrew Jackson's discussion of how everything is going. And so when I work with students, we talk about things like, excuse some of the highlights there from when I work with students, some words that sometimes they don't know. But we're looking here, we talk about the tone. What is the tone of the excerpt? Can you tell? Does this surprise you? So I call upon us to draw upon our understanding, who is Andrew Jackson? Would this be in line with what we know of him? Things like that. And we talk about, interesting way it was framed. It's framed as everyone is happy. There are numerous benefits to this arrangement. And we talk about that. And we also talk about, how does President Jackson view Native Americans as a people, and how can we tell? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Is it okay?
Yes, please.
So I'm from Tennessee, and in the 80s, I remember in was it middle school? No, it was elementary school. Pretty much in every corner of Tennessee schools, their school field trip was to go to Nashville, well, the area in Nashville where the Hermitage is.
Oh, yeah.
And I will never forget the brainwashing that went along with the kids, in elementary school, with talking about how revered he was. And I remember specifically them spinning it to saying that he provided Indians good land, their own space, et cetera, et cetera. It never mentioned the institution of slavery, but I specifically remember in the 80s them saying that he was this pretty much this, because he's very revered in Tennessee and of course throughout the South, but he was the provider of all of this for the Native American population. And it was just so crazy.
I got this, it's kind of
We're
hard
there every year.
to see, but
Yeah.
this, you may have seen this before.
Oh, yeah.
These are Native people that he's pulled in here.
Yeah.
This was done by Thomas Nast in Harper's Weekly. It's called The Great White Father. And that's exactly the narrative that you're talking about. And the reason why I think that is so dangerous is because one of the things I try to help students understand, because, if a student learned that when they were young, and then they read an excerpt of a newspaper, they might think, oh, because Andrew Jackson said it, then this is true. So we have to, that's why when I do this full activity with students, we look at different excerpts and we try to see, wait a minute, this person's account of what's going on completely contradicts what Andrew Jackson is saying. What does that mean? Does that mean I can't trust everything that Andrew Jackson said? But why would he have said that? And and then that helps us to kind of get into, people are people, and it doesn't mean because they are dead or they were important or they were president that what they're saying is true. And doesn't mean that everyone's points of view are going to connect. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Please,
I had a flashback there.
if you have comments, please. I really like it to be more of a discussion.
I'm curious, when you're teaching students about, when you're reading that and you're talking about it, are you teaching in sort of like a two-part way of part one, this is what and why he said it in the context of the time that he was in, and then part two, this is how it looks now?
Certainly, whenever I begin classes, I say, and it sounds elementary, but I have to remind students to do it, even universities. So we're going to put on our 19th century classes. We're going to put on our 18th century classes today. And what that is, let's think about this, we can't judge people based on our values now. That's not always fair. But we can, however, I believe, talk about what was problematic about this. So again, I try to not demonize, because I don't, as an archivist, my goal is to provide access and not to interpret for them. So I try to say, let's go ahead and put on our whatever century glasses. But then after we do that, let's look at it from what we know is human and true and exactly and moral. And we can talk about that. We can. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I do have to remind students to do that. Because sometimes when I show certain things, I had another presentation related to this, something that students were like, oh my gosh, this person was so racist. And I was like, well, actually, this was considered like really progressive for this time. So we have to kind of talk about those differences. But yeah, it is always sometimes shocking to see something like this.
Well, I would imagine too that it's so easy to just stay in 21st century.
It is. It's very easy. So we have to intentionally kind of go back and be like, okay, let's look at when this person was brought up. Let's look at this and want to understand them. But doesn't mean we have to change our view of this, but it is good but no, it's very important. And that's something that you have to do as an archivist, curator, historian, researcher of any type. So that's a very, very good point. This excerpt number 2 is a really good example. I won't read the whole thing, but this, it was not really written by William Penn. It was a different time period. This was a pseudonym. The man it was just someone who wanted to write on behalf of the Native Americans, but didn't want to say anything. So here, I highlighted a couple things, like this paragraph up at the top. Again, saying Indians are compared ourselves a feeble race of men, they're far removed, they've got scanty means of access, they have no patronage. He's trying to set up and say that, if you read the whole thing, he is not in support of Native American removal. And he's explaining why it's problematic. And however, so we essentially are like, yes, that's kind of where we want to go. But if you look here, I have to try to tell students, like, it's very patronizing, the way that he's speaking. And very ignorantly patronizing. And so we have to kind of realize, okay, well, this is, again, 1830. So I think he was attempting to explain why Native American removal, according to him, was not a good idea for Native Americans or for Americans, for, white Americans. But really, I think that, again, you have to kind of view it really as, okay, who is speaking? Who's he speaking to? Why would he have used these words? Things like that. So this one is a really challenging piece because you want to agree, but it's the way that he presents it isn't quite the way that we would be, used to seeing something. So this is one. And then, but again, we've seen in these first two excerpts, these are just people speaking on behalf of the Cherokees. We haven't heard what they view, their view. And so this next one here.
So I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Even when I see the word a feeble race of men.
Yeah.
I mean.
There's so much that.
It's like, well, you, from a genocide standpoint, based on the disease, et cetera, for the individuals that were able to survive, I don't understand how, not to denounce anything with regards to those who have passed, to those who perished. Where do you get feeble out of that?
Right.
Exactly.
They had to be stronger than, exactly.
Well, and in 1830, the 5 civilized tribes were anything but feeble race of men because many of them were very profitable within their own right, within their tribes.
That's very true.
And within the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nation in particular, and probably even within the Cherokee on sometimes states. So we really look at Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. But they're slave owners. So and Chickasaw per capita was the largest slave-holding tribe out of the 5, and many of them have very much embraced assimilation within white culture, and they're also owning large swaths of land within what we now know as the Old South. So in 1830, they're profitable and they have plantations. So
Exactly.
So it's interesting that someone who is writing in not support of removal, would say that they're evil.
He's going for a very
it's like
this argument that's
the ethnocentric
Well, is it
argument,
possible that
but-
there's a hint of irony in the way in which this is?
I haven't considered that, but maybe.
Almost like kind of going all the way to the extreme in order to pull you back in support of a position.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
I read this first, the hyperbole in the first paragraph is almost to a point of extremity that if you can read it as extreme racism or extreme prejudice, or you could read it as a sort of hyperbolic statement of extremity that then is basically saying, this is dumb, this extremity is dumb, come back to reason.
Sure. That was a very good point. I've never even considered that. So thank you for bringing that up. You just never, again, I love this. I love it because that's another point. That's why I think it's really, really important to continuously, view archival records. Again, we don't know the exact truth, but let's see if we can, I think this man's name was, what was his name? I think I have it written down. Jeremiah Everards, I think. I don't know much about him, but that would require, I wonder, more research about him, and could we figure out exactly how he would have written this and why, and so those are really, really good points. I'm excited to bring that one up with my classes when I teach this next. So again, this one is a difficult piece to kind of wrap your head around at first. This one is a little bit more straightforward, sort of, but these are, I guess, the legal counsel for the Cherokee Nation helped them to kind of create their points that they brought to the state of Georgia. The Cherokees are a sovereign nation, and they had information about, the territory is not within jurisdiction of the state of Georgia, override, et cetera, and et cetera. I like number 6, that the President of the United States has no constitutional power to fix the boundary between the Cherokee Nation and the state of Georgia, because that's another thing dealing with, we're dealing with federal and state here, and that's we're crossing lines there. And so this I also bring out to kind of show, how, and again, not speaking for all Cherokee people, but I guess the Cherokee that were in power, kind of viewed what the important points were, what they wanted to the government to understand about their sovereignty. And so we also I like to talk about, other groups of people. When I try to get students to think, when have you seen other groups of people bring a series of points? Have a series of points maybe brought to a government or to the oppressor, and are saying this is what we want. So we talk about that. Anyway, these are just a couple of the excerpts that you'll see in the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper issue that we have. So again, here they're all just written on Word documents, but one of the things that is really great about doing archival research is seeing where these are actually placed in the newspaper and seeing kind of how that conversation works. And so things like that I think are just fascinating. But really getting into a document takes time. It takes questioning, just asking questions. It takes it contradicts one another, these voices, and who are these voices, and understanding which voices are missing. Who are we not hearing? Mm-hmm. We're hearing certain people that have enough, I guess, prominence to make it into the newspaper for one reason or another. But they're speaking for, when we aggregate the Cherokees or the Indians, who are we not hearing? Which voices are we missing? So that's also a really important part about archival research, is understanding, okay, who am I not hearing and why am I not hearing them? So I wanted to kind of just give an example of how I encourage my researchers and my students to look at the archival work. Okay, and then here, I'm not going to show the entire video. I don't know, have you all ever heard Cherokee spoken before? Yeah, it's a really, really, I love it. Wonderful language. But one thing I want to do is show a little video, just an excerpt, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes of it. Let's see. Okay. So this was a project to save the Cherokee language. I don't know if y'all know, but a lot of Native American languages are, they're very much endangered. Very, very much endangered. A lot of it had to do with really, really aggressive assimilation tactics that have been done really since the 19th century, even into I think the 1970s and maybe even around there. So in North Carolina, where the Eastern Band of Cherokees are, they have a language preservation project. So I wanted to kind of show a little bit about that. And that is also why we're very interested in Cherokee printing and the Cherokee language itself in our collection.
You leave one mission and squeeze like that and go on the end you guys you leave one me. The car we don't say it. So we're in the dance currently out there got me. So whoa okay. The box come over each day. I said no key to walk right. The box to get the morning started on this day easily got me. The box the mornings which they like that. Là cách tạo này không chỉ cây đi xuống ai được dây cái kỳ rất là lắm cái gì nói tao câu nó là architect người quay họ nó bị một căn được con tối cái sự thứ sai là cái gì ấy cả ba biết cái căn được con
I'm going to say, on me. It's called the War Yen. The War Yen. A lot of Cherokee language was used. It was all used in the games when I played back in the 50s and 60s. On both teams, both sides, whether it's Birdtown or Wolftown or Nightown, we all spoke the Cherokee language. And we talked Cherokee in the ball game. I mean, you don't know.
Zabutashikishi theologication. Ikaweda tangozication. Seleko zimonishkan. Novetini omegat. Ani monishkan.
Well, hey, they were talking to do it again, huh? And they use and you don't know, like, is it? God or something. The love was the monistigation.
They did speak in Cherokee, mostly all of them, way back when I was growing up. There weren't too many people that speak in English, just a few of them. And you go to the home, they all speak in Cherokee. Everywhere you went. And now, you can't go nowhere, so they say, I don't know how to speak it.
They use and you don't know, like, is it? God or something. The love was the monistigation. Now, so the substance that we pay of stage, you need and you want to the left button. So you tell us. The case into the left button, you will stand again, you yet select the one to be learned again.
We were not allowed to speak our languages.
So that just gives you an idea. I wanted to just kind of show, but it's a really, really great documentary about kind of what they're doing with children to preserve the language, and so it's really, really great. And then I just wanted to say some next steps that we have. I'm continuing to collect materials related to the Cherokee language, and of course for us, our materials are very much focused on Cherokee language, and so that's kind of like our little scope. But I'm really excited because I've been wanting to do an exhibit for years now, and it's kind of gotten put off because of other exhibits, but I think I'm really excited for 2021. I plan to do a Cherokee exhibit in the Athenaeum Gallery upstairs in partnership with the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. They're planning to have one, I know, I'm excited. They're planning to have one on Native Americans, I think in World War I. So I figured it'd be a really great way for, they're in our department too, so for us to kind of do a tie-in. So again, continuing to collect and our materials, and I've actually been working with some community members too, the Georgia Trail of Tears Association, and a variety of scholars to kind of really see what else is out there that I'd love to showcase in the exhibit and what can add to our narrative. So that's kind of where we are. But I'm very excited for more progress. But I wanted to just see if anyone had final thoughts or questions before we come up and take a look at some materials.
Are you thinking of borrowing materials from other states?
Yeah, I think I'm going to do that. I was thinking too, I know even here, like I know Reinhardt has the Funk Heritage Center. So I was thinking they may have some things too. I'm gonna first though, what I really wanna do, I'd like to always kind of include our community. So I'm first gonna see if I can get some things on them from just members of the indigenous people here that we know. But yes, that's definitely a possibility.
What do you find is the hardest part with archiving Native American, you know, books and stuff like that? Because I know there's been problems in the past, especially with like the Smithsonian and stuff like that, to where technically it was stolen material.
Exactly.
And they have problems getting their, you know, their ancestors' bones back, which they deserve to have, and their, you know, burial grounds and stuff like that. So what do you find is the hardest part of getting the materials and having it, you know?
That's a great question. I think for me, definitely the hardest part is that I am not of indigenous descent, and I don't know that, like personally, that many people that are. And so whenever you're in Arkansas, the first thing you have to do is really, before you start collecting anything, I'm like, I have to talk to people and ask. Because as an archivist, I don't collect as many artifacts as maybe like a museum curator. We focus mostly on like photographs, documents, those kinds of things. However, for exhibits, you do want some artifacts. I get very wary with that because with a lot of, even if the material, the artifact wasn't stolen, there are some artifacts, especially in Native American cultures, that like certain people aren't supposed to see or are used just for ceremony. And actually having it on exhibit would be totally offensive. Those are things, again, I would do out of ignorance, not any malicious intent. Those are things, it just takes a lot of learning. So I think that's the hardest part. It's a huge learning curve. And again, talking to people and getting, you know, but also I realize as an archivist, people aren't gonna just wanna talk to you because you work at Kennesaw State. They're like, why are you asking me this? I don't know you. I barely want to answer your questions, and no, you can't have my grandmother's this and that. So it takes a lot of going to, I've gone to so many people's homes, lunches, you know, just goodwill, keeping in contact before they'll tell you anything.
Building trust.
Building trust is a big, especially with groups that have been historically marginalized. I will be honest, for me, I've noticed I can make better inroads with the African American community here because there's just an automatic, okay, she must be okay because she looks like me. Whereas some of my colleagues have had a lot of issues. So it depends. So when you're dealing with like historically marginalized communities, you just have to really put in the time to do a lot to just get their trust because in the past, people have tried to take advantage of them or no one has cared. So they're like, why do you just all of a sudden care? So that's really the big part is learning and making sure people trust me and know that I don't have malicious intentions.
To your point, I just came from Wisconsin where there are 13 federally recognized tribes. And, one of the things that we did in the city of Oshkosh, which is Chief Oshkosh, there's a monument, but the monument was in English, not in the language. So with the mayor and with members of his tribe, we actually came together and they helped to write the history for the monument in their language.
That's very
and that was a huge thing for the city.
That is huge, and I've noticed that. I think as people they don't like to, they're like, okay, if this is great to have this monument, but like, what about our voice?
That's right.
Literally.
That's right.
Exactly.
I appreciate you giving the excerpts as examples, not just on the screen, but actually in front of us, because you can read it on the screen, and it actually is completely different than if you're actually sitting with it in front of you.
Very
so
true.
You can actually see it and read it yourself and digest it. But I'm the CEO of the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation in Franklin, Tennessee, and it's a witness site to Indian removal because it's where the Treaty of Franklin of 1830 was negotiated. So, but what is so remarkable about that is that only within the past 2 years have people in Franklin particularly begun to care about that this building that still stands, that is still a functioning Masonic lodge. There is a lodge that still meets on the second and third floors, but the first floor is where this very important yet very genocidal activity was taking place. Between sitting President Andrew Jackson, on eating, on coffee, members and distinguished citizens of Franklin and Nashville, and then 21 leaders of the Chickasaw Nation. And when we tell people that, it really blows them away on tours because it's never been taught in school. The only thing most people, particularly, I'm a Gen Xer. We learned about the Trail of Tears and Cherokee, but we never really learned about the removal of Choctaw Chickasaw Creek and what really truly happened to Seminoles. So to be here at this particular site and working through all of the very difficult, multi-layered histories that took place in this building, but then recognizing this building as a witness site because of its landmark status due to this one particular issue is something that we're challenged with because we have so many people who are ignorant to the history surrounding the removal, and they're like, well, Jackson was here, and Jackson, fought side by side with these Native people, so why would, Jackson want to remove them? Clearly, he would want to do it for their safekeeping. So we always have to break it down, and of course on a tour, it's really hard to put things in people's hands. But we're always leading people to websites. We'll definitely lead people to your archives and to what you all are doing
Thank you
here.
so much.
Because Tennessee obviously does have Cherokee history as
Yes.
well, particularly southwestern Tennessee. But even in Franklin, that was once Shawnee, Chickasaw, and Cherokee area. And so to really understand why coming to Franklin was so important, even though the Chickasaw had already given up their tracts of land in 1805 and 1816 to the federal government in this part of Tennessee, which is Williamson County today. It's interesting to know that a building that was the meeting place for a negotiation for this particular issue still stands today. And it's really the only time in U.S. history where a sitting president ever traveled outside of D.C. to meet with Native peoples to discuss removal. But again, to excerpt one, when you're reading about Jackson, and this is his written word, it's interesting to see his actual handwriting.
Sure, exactly.
In the tree for what he was going to be speaking and presenting to the Chickasaw in Franklin the summer of 1830. And the funny thing is Jackson wrote it, but he did not read it to them. It was John Eaton who delivered it. But then the Chickasaw demanded that, even though Jackson was kind of in Franklin and in the shadows, because Jackson, that's his home turf, he kind of knew everybody in that community. He was kind of holding back and waiting. The funny thing is they originally met in the Presbyterian Church. So it was more of an oration. So when you read the speech, you can kind of put it into perspective when you're giving that historical contextualization of not just what they were reading, but where they were doing this. A church versus a Masonic hall. The hall on the first floor was really a community space. So because they didn't appreciate the oration as far as this religiosity surrounding, I, your great father, take his red children by the hand, which is what the words were that he wrote, that Eaton delivered. That's when the Chickasaw leaders said, we want to have a meeting with Jackson and we want to pick the place. And so they picked this particular song.
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting to also see how, when you're really looking at public history and how you have to present the transparency and present the facts, you're very right. You cannot think 21st century, because if you do, then you're actually damaging the ability and hindering the ability for those that have no conceptual idea about this history in the first place to not be able to have their own ability to digest the information that's being presented.
Can we look at the
Yes,
the
please go
artifacts?
ahead.
So I just really appreciated all of this because it gives me some ideas now too on the work that we're continuing to do and build upon the history, because it's such a difficult history to talk
It is. And I think sometimes, with this kind of thing, sometimes people think that you're, indicting them because they are of a certain group, and no, we're talking about it. And it's okay to talk about it. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's not something that's fun to talk about, but we need to. So I think that's just great. Thank you so much for that feedback.
And the interesting thing is that, you can't demonize Jackson, you can't demonize really any of the players, because our job is to provide the information and interpret the information through the contextual lens. And
Exactly.
sometimes that doesn't happen at historic sites.
Exactly. I know it can be quite, yes. I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear about the narrative change and about how there's been some, actually trying to say what really happened versus, because it's when people grow up thinking a certain thing and then you change it on them and tell them like more accurate, sometimes they're like, wait, what?
Right, well, and where we are in Franklin, it's really a Civil War community.
Sure.
Battle of Franklin of 1864 has really become the selling point for heritage tourism.
Okay.
So while our site also has significant Civil War history, it's an historic landmark because of Indian removal. So, we're starting to really get the community to realize that there's more to Franklin than just a battle.
Exactly.
And then really to understand the built environment, why did this building be so important?
Sure.
Who constructed the building, who were the enslaved people, and so
Exactly.
we're really, I think,
That's
one of the only
good.
sites that's doing that kind of contextual work.
Yeah.
And it's finally starting to get traction and gain some attention.
Oh, I'm so glad.
But
Good.
it's helpful
To see this.
because sometimes you feel like you're on an island.
I know, exactly. I'm so glad it's been helpful.
Yes.
And yes, y'all please touch things too if you like, come up. We've got things we just collected over the past 6 years. This is my newest one. This is the New Testament in Cherokee. This one is actually a really rare one. So I had to get one where the binding was a little bit broken, but